What happens when a man discovers a truth so dangerous that his own country decides to bury it with him? Berlin, 1943. The empire that Hitler promised would last 1,000 years was beginning to crumble silently under the weight of its own illusions. And it was in this scenario that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, made a discovery that would change the course and the end of the war. An officer of the old guard, aristocratic, rational, and driven by an almost religious faith in facts, he came across an espionage report that spoke not of armies or generals, but of something far more dangerous: numbers. It was a cold, impersonal, and devastating document, a calculation that predicted the inevitable collapse of the Reich in less than 2 years. And the reason for this mathematical prophecy had a name: Willow Run, a gigantic American factory in the state of Michigan, designed to reach a cadence of one 4-engine B-24 Liberator bomber per hour at peak operation. Canaris understood immediately. Germany was not losing a battle, it was losing the war itself. Defeat would not come from the trenches, but from the assembly lines thousands of kilometers away. The document on his desk was an affront to the very spirit of Nazism. There were no exaltations to the Aryan race, no quotes from the Führer. Its language was the most dangerous of all: mathematics. Production charts, aluminum consumption tables, man-hour projections. Cold, impersonal, and therefore irrefutable. For a regime driven by ideological faith and inflammatory speeches, it was heresy. But Canaris saw beyond the columns and numbers. He saw a mirror. Every line of that report reflected the reality that the Third Reich refused to face. He knew that if those numbers were correct, Germany's fate was sealed. And he also knew that the regime would prefer to break the mirror rather than see the reflection. The content seemed like science fiction. Willow Run, a single industrial plant designed by architect Albert Kahn and financed by the Ford Motor Company, had been built with an unprecedented goal: to manufacture bombers as if they were cars. The assembly line, over 1.5 kilometers long, transformed steel, aluminum, and human sweat into 30-ton war machines with millimeter precision. Each employee performed a single task: tightening rivets, installing cables, polishing windows, without ever needing to understand the whole. It was the logic of mass production applied to destruction, a method that seemed inhuman but worked. And contrary to the Nazi belief that the German will would overcome any obstacle, Canaris understood what that report really said. The modern war would not be won by courage, but by cadence. Germany built art, America time, and time was running out. Canaris, methodical and incredibly lucid, reviewed the numbers dozens of times, searching for errors. There were none. The entire German aeronautical industry, combining all its factories, did not reach a third of Willow Run's projected capacity. It was an industrial avalanche impossible to stop. With surgical precision, he drafted his opinion. If American production projections prove correct, the Luftwaffe's air superiority will become unsustainable in 12 to 18 months. It was a warning, a desperate attempt to force the regime to see what lay ahead, but the response was laughter. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, is said to have mocked, "The Americans? They make refrigerators, not planes." The document was filed under the heading of little strategic relevance, buried, just like the man who dared to believe in logic. While Willow Run's presses hammered steel 6,000 kilometers from Berlin, Canaris understood a truth no one wanted to hear. The Third Reich was not being defeated by its enemies, it was being defeated by reality. To understand why Wilhelm Canaris was the only man in Berlin capable of seeing the abyss while everyone else saw glory, one must delve into his mind, a labyrinth of logic, skepticism, and conflicting loyalties. He was not a Nazi in the fanatical sense of the term. He was an old guard patriot, shaped by the Imperial Navy, discipline, and the belief that national honor was above any ideology. When Hitler came to power, Canaris, like many conservative officers, saw him as a temporary remedy for the humiliation of Versailles.
But what began as pragmatism soon became discomfort. The admiral realized that the regime he helped serve was driven not by strategy, but by faith. And faith, he knew, does not replace fuel, steel, or production. While the party saw the war as a racial epic, Canaris saw numbers, supply lines, and the inevitable mathematics of destruction. At the head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, he built something few understood at the time, a global espionage network that operated like a parallel mind to the Reich itself. His agents were not cloak-and-dagger assassins, but engineers, bankers, diplomats, and merchants. They collected industrial catalogs, company balance sheets, export reports, seemingly banal fragments that together formed the invisible map of world power. Canaris believed that a ton of aluminum said more about a war than any entire battalion. This cold and objective view put him on a direct collision course with the party's ideologues. For Hitler and Goebbels, will shaped reality. For Canaris, reality shaped the winners. Canaris's mind worked like a moral and strategic calculator. He could see the enemy not as a demon, but as a system.
And that's what made him dangerous. While Göring laughed at the American refrigerator makers, Canaris studied the financial structure of Ford, General Motors statistics, and Tennessee Valley Authority energy reports. Through neutral sources in Switzerland and Sweden, he traced what he called the enemy's productive profile, an accurate estimate of how many aircraft, tanks, and munitions the United States could produce per month if it mobilized its full industrial potential. The numbers were so high, they seemed fictional, but Canaris knew they weren't, and that knowledge was his burden. In his personal diary, more philosophical than military, he noted an enigmatic phrase: "The modern man will not be defeated by the sword, but by the machine." For him, the true battlefield of World War II was not Normandy, nor Stalingrad, but Detroit. It was there that the fate of the century was being decided, in the assembly lines, time clocks, presses, and conveyor belts that never stopped. Canaris understood that total war was no longer about bravery, but about system, and the American system, to the horror of his Germanic reasoning, was chaotic and efficient at the same time, a combination that Nazism could never replicate. Germany was trying to win the 20th century with a 19th century mindset. Canaris saw that the Third Reich was fighting against time itself. But lucidity comes at a high price. The Gestapo began to suspect the philosopher Admiral. His cold analyses and constant warnings were seen as defeatism. Men like Himmler and Heydrich despised him. They called him a dangerous intellectual, a deadly euphemism in a regime that thrived on disciplined ignorance. And yet, Canaris continued writing reports, ever more careful, ever more ambiguous. He learned to hide truths in neutral phrases. Reassessment of production targets is recommended meant, we're sinking. It was the game of survival. The truth needed to be told, but told in a way that no one heard it. That winter of 1943, as American factories roared in 3 shifts and planes left Michigan every hour, Canaris understood that Germany had already lost. It just didn't know it yet. And ignorance, at that moment, was the Reich's deadliest weapon. While the Reich celebrated illusory victories and ever more empty speeches, on the other side of the Atlantic, a new form of power was taking shape, a war driven not by ideology, but by production. The name of its heart was Willow Run in the state of Michigan. There, the sound of progress was that of hammers, rivets, and Pratt & Whitney engines tested without rest. It was a sound Canaris would never hear in person, but it already echoed in his mind like a metallic omen. Every beat of the presses in Willow Run was a cruel reminder. The enemy had turned war into mechanical arithmetic, and in that equation, Germany was doomed. Willow Run was more than a factory. It was a city under one roof, designed by Albert Kahn, the greatest industrial architect of the century, and financed by the Ford Motor Company. It spanned over 67 acres, becoming the largest continuous building in the world. Its main line, nearly 1.5 kilometers long, snaked like a river of steel and sweat. There, 42,000 workers, men, women, and immigrants, operated 24 hours a day, divided into 3 shifts.
When a siren sounded, another group took the place of those leaving. The machines did not sleep. The goal was simple and merciless: keep the line alive. At the peak of production, a B-24 Liberator bomber left the end of the conveyor belt every 63 minutes. It was the pinnacle of Henry Ford's vision, turning the impossible into routine. The secret lay in the decomposition of labor. Each task, no matter how complex, was reduced to elementary gestures. The assembly of a bomber, a machine with over 30,000 parts, was fragmented into thousands of micro-tasks. Each worker repeated a single movement, dozens of times per hour, until precision became instinct. The result was a war product created with the same logic that had put the Model T on the world's roads. Ford didn't just build planes. He manufactured time, and in time, as Canaris understood, lay the true power. American genius was not just mechanical, but social. The shortage of men, sent to the front, forced the country to open factory doors to those society had previously marginalized. A new army was born, made of women and black workers, immigrants, peasants displaced by unemployment.
Propaganda showed determined faces. Rosie the Riveter, the woman with the red headscarf and firm gaze, became the symbol of national strength. At Willow Run, about 1/3 of the workforce was female, and thousands of African Americans migrated from the rural South to the industrial North. What the Reich called racial degeneration, the United States transformed into productive energy. It was a cruel paradox. The diversity the Nazis despised was the true source of the enemy's victory. For Canaris, who followed the data through encrypted reports from Switzerland, it was a logical nightmare. While the Nazi high command exalted racial purity, he saw an impure country winning through the union of its differences. While the German regime punished doubt, he saw an entire nation questioning, adjusting, and evolving. Willow Run was not just a factory. It was the prototype of the future, a world where efficiency would replace heroism. And that idea tormented him, because, deep down, Canaris knew the man who thinks can foresee tragedy, but rarely prevent it. As engines roared in Michigan and planes rose into the skies, Canaris, alone in his Berlin office, noted in his diary a phrase that summed up everything he knew and everything the regime refused to understand. War is no longer decided by who shoots first, but by who manufactures more. Within the marble corridors of Nazi power, denying reality was not a mistake, it was a virtue. In 1943, as bombs fell on the Ruhr and Abwehr reports predicted catastrophe, Berlin lived in a bubble, carefully constructed by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda. Newspapers still announced victories. Radios spoke of tactical retreats, and on the walls of the War Ministry, the words "Final Victory" were repeated with the same devotion as the Lord's Prayer. But behind the scenes, Canaris knew the Reich was bleeding in silence. The problem was no longer a lack of resources, but the refusal to admit they were gone. High command meetings had turned into theatrical rituals. Generals in impeccable uniforms, faces shining with sweat and fear, competed to please the Führer with falsely optimistic reports. The true numbers, the Luftwaffe's losses, the collapse of fuel supply, the disappearance of aluminum, were carefully omitted. Hitler didn't want data. He wanted faith, and his subordinates gave him exactly that, in deadly doses. Canaris, with his icy calm, observed in silence. He saw Germany being run like a religion, not a nation. And in every religion, he thought, the heretics of reason are always the first to be burned. Once, in a general staff meeting, a young engineer presented charts showing the vertiginous drop in air production. His proposal was simple: retreat, preserve resources, and focus efforts on defense. Before he finished, a general with a thundering voice interrupted him. "You speak like a defeatist." The room erupted in applause. The engineer was removed, sent to the Eastern Front, where he disappeared weeks later. Canaris watched the scene in silence, tasting the bitterness of repetition. He understood that he was no longer fighting ignorance, but a system that rewarded lies and punished lucidity. The Reich had become a theater of shadows, where truth was the enemy. The Gestapo, under the paranoid command of Heinrich Himmler, watched everything, and Canaris, the man who knew too much, began to be treated as a risk. His reports on Willow Run and American production capacity were classified as alarmist. His phone calls were tapped, his assistants interrogated. The Abwehr, once an elite institution, was slowly swallowed up by the party's security apparatus. Canaris sensed the noose tightening, but did not retreat. He knew that stopping writing would mean accepting madness, so he continued. But now his words came masked in technical language, carefully calibrated to tell the truth without ever pronouncing it. Each report was an act of resistance, disguised as bureaucracy. In Berlin's discreet cafes, some officers still dared to whisper his name with respect. "He's the only lucid one among the blind," they said. But lucidity, in those times, was a death sentence. Canaris knew his time was running out. In one of his last confidential reports, he wrote, "Modern wars are not lost on the battlefield. They are lost when leadership confuses belief with reality." Those words never reached Hitler. They were intercepted, filed, and forgotten. The Third Reich, driven by blind faith in its own invincibility, marched toward the abyss with firm step and raised gaze, while the Führer dreamed of a 1,000-year empire. Canaris knew the countdown had already begun, and the clock, relentless, was not in Berlin. It was in Michigan, ticking every hour with the birth of a new American bomber. In 1944, Wilhelm Canaris was no longer seen as the head of German military intelligence. To the high command, he had become something more dangerous, a man who thought for himself. His analytical mind, once celebrated as brilliant, was now treated as subversive. Nazi Germany feared internal doubters as much as external enemies, and Canaris, with his reports full of inconvenient truths, was the greatest of them all. He still signed documents, still attended general staff meetings, but knew his days of influence were over.
The walls of the Reich began to have ears, and those ears belonged to the Gestapo. The relationship between Canaris and Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, had been one of mutual distrust from the start. Himmler saw the Abwehr as an obstacle, an elitist institution, challenging the SS's omnipotence. Canaris, in turn, saw in Himmler the exact portrait of what he despised most: fanaticism disguised as efficiency. When Abwehr reports began to contradict the propaganda ministry's optimistic projections, Canaris's fate was sealed. His loyalty was questioned. "Does he serve Germany or himself?" they asked in the corridors. The regime he had helped protect now classified him as a potential traitor, and in the Reich, mere suspicion was already a condemnation. Surveillance intensified, his assistants were followed, his correspondence intercepted. Even official trips that once were part of his routine were limited. Canaris, the man who knew Europe's secrets, had become a prisoner in his own office. Still, he continued to act, but now in the shadows. Knowing Germany was doomed, he began using the Abwehr itself to save what could still be saved of the nation's morals and conscience. He helped diplomats maintain contact with the resistance, warned neutral countries of imminent attacks, and even facilitated the escape of Jews under the guise of official missions. For a regime obsessed with purity and obedience, these acts were unforgivable. In secret, Canaris kept a diary.
In pages scribbled at night under dim light, he mixed philosophical reflections and dark confessions. "Madness rules the state," he wrote once, "and whoever tries to cure it is declared ill." Those notes would become his final testimony. He still believed in Germany, but not that Germany. The nation he saw crumbling in despair and fanaticism was unrecognizable to the aristocratic officer who had sworn to serve the Kaiser decades before. His fight was no longer for victory, it was for the moral redemption of a country that had forgotten how to think. The noose tightened, and the Abwehr began to crumble. The Gestapo arrested officers on vague charges of espionage or sabotage. The network carefully built by Canaris over the years was dismantled in weeks. In February 1944, the Abwehr was officially absorbed by the SS, a mercy stroke delivered by Himmler, who now controlled all Reich intelligence. Canaris lost command, but instead of being completely removed, he was kept in a symbolic position, a cruel form of permanent surveillance. The Gestapo men wanted to watch him bleed slowly, disarmed as he saw everything he had built destroyed before his eyes. In the midst of this political hell, Canaris would still find strength to participate, albeit indirectly, in the greatest conspiracy against Hitler, the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt. And it would be that desperate attempt to save Germany from itself that finally transformed him, in the regime's eyes, from spy to enemy of the state. July 1944. The Third Reich was in silent collapse. The fronts were disintegrating, the Luftwaffe a ghost, and Berlin surviving on speeches. But there were still men, few, lucid, who believed Germany could only be saved by destroying the Führer himself. Among them, old guard officers, brave civilians, and in the shadows, Wilhelm Canaris. He was not a conspirator in the traditional sense, but his influence hovered over all who dared think the unthinkable, killing Hitler. His Abwehr, already mutilated by the Gestapo, had become the discreet meeting point for generals and diplomats dreaming of a Germany without the delirium. The plan, led by Claus von Stauffenberg, seemed impossible, but it was all that remained. A bomb in a briefcase, left discreetly under the conference table at Hitler's headquarters in Rostenburg. The goal was clear: eliminate the dictator, seize army control, and negotiate a surrender before Germany was completely destroyed. Canaris did not participate directly in the operation, but many of his former agents were involved. It was he who, months earlier, had helped bring together men who shared the same conviction. The true treason was to continue obeying. The assassination was prepared in secret, amid prayers and silence. And on July 20, 1944, the history of the Reich trembled. The explosion was devastating, but not enough. Hitler survived with minor injuries, protected by the concrete base of the table. The plot collapsed in hours. The conspirators were arrested, tortured, and executed with exemplary brutality. Recordings of their deaths, ordered by Goebbels, were shown to the Führer himself as morbid entertainment. And with each execution, the regime's fury grew. "There are more traitors than we imagined," Himmler roared. And among the names whispered in the SS's dark corridors, one repeated insistently: Wilhelm Canaris. In the days following the attempt, Germany plunged into a wave of paranoia. Any lack of enthusiasm was suspect, any silence, guilt. The Gestapo searched houses, offices, and safes. When they reached Canaris's residence, they found what was enough to seal his fate: his secret diaries, carefully hidden in a metal safe. In them, investigators read his reflections on the regime, his veiled criticisms of Hitler, and, Worst of all, his notes on contacts with opponents and foreign diplomats. That was more than evidence. It was proof that in the heart of the Reich, the head of intelligence had become the conscience the regime tried to silence. Canaris was arrested on July 22, 1944. There was no formal interrogation or trial.
He was taken to the Prinz Albrechtstrasse prison, Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, the same building where so many of his enemies had vanished. There, the roles reversed. The interrogator became the interrogated. For months, he was kept in solitary confinement, not knowing if he would be executed or forgotten. But even as a prisoner, he maintained a serenity that irritated his captors. He speaks little, but the gaze is unbearable, an SS officer wrote. It's as if he still knows more than we do. In the icy silence of the cell, Canaris reflected on the failure of the attempt and the fate awaiting Germany. He knew the war was lost, but the true horror, he thought, was that the country still hadn't realized it. Hitler had survived physically, but the Reich was already dead. Only the body kept moving. In his diary, he had written a phrase that now sounded like an epitaph. Men prefer ruin to repentance. And Germany, he concluded, had preferred delirium to redemption. When Soviet troops approached Berlin months later, Canaris was still breathing, but no longer belonged to this world. His final fate would be sealed not by a foreign enemy, but by the hand of the regime he had tried to save from madness. The winter 1945 arrived with a different cold, the cold of the end. Berlin was no longer the capital of an empire, but the tomb of a feverish dream. In the ruins of a disintegrating regime, Wilhelm Canaris awaited his fate, a prisoner of his own compatriots. After months of isolation, he had been transferred to the Flossenburg concentration camp, a place chosen specifically for oblivion. There, the man who once commanded one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence machines had become just a number. But even without uniform, even without voice, Canaris still carried what made him dangerous: lucidity. His cell was small, damp, and windowless. The walls, scratched with prayers and faded names, seemed to breathe the despair of those who had passed before him. During the day, Canaris was forced to perform insignificant tasks, cleaning corridors or stacking torn papers. At night, he wrote with graphite stubs, hiding notes between the floorboards. Those fragments, discovered after the war, reveal a mind still on alert, observing, analyzing, resisting in silence. I do not fear death. I fear that the world will forget what reason was able to predict and blind faith was able to destroy. In his words, there was no hate, only methodical sadness. He did not see himself as a martyr, but as a witness condemned to understand too much. Meanwhile, in Berlin, chaos reigned. Soviet armies already surrounded the city, and Hitler's bunker had become the stage for a psychological collapse. In the midst of delirium, the Führer demanded vengeance against all traitors. It was in this context of paranoia and despair that Canaris's name resurfaced. Seized documents, testimonies extracted under torture, and unfounded rumors were compiled into a dossier forged by the SS. The conclusion was inevitable. Canaris had conspired against the Führer, collaborated with enemies, and sabotaged the war effort. There was no concrete proof, but in the Reich, guilt needed no evidence, only convenience. On April 8, 1945, Canaris was brought to trial. But trial was a generous word. The proceeding, conducted within Flossenburg itself, lasted less than 2 hours. There was no defense, no witnesses. The tribunal consisted of nervous, hurried SS officers, eager to fulfill one last order from Hitler before everything collapsed.
When asked if he had anything to declare, Canaris replied in a calm voice, "I have served Germany since before any of you were born, and I still serve it, perhaps in a way you do not understand." The silence that followed was heavier than any sentence. He already knew what was coming. The decision, hastily written on a stained sheet, ordered immediate execution by hanging. In the early morning hours that followed, guards dragged him from his cell. He walked without resistance, with the same austere countenance as always.
Witnesses report that as they bound his hands, he murmured a final phrase: "Germany lost the war the day it killed reason." There were no screams, no audience. The execution was quick and silent. A piano wire, improvised and cruel, sealed the fate of the man who dared think amid fanaticism. His body was cremated in secret, and the ashes scattered anonymously. The next day, Soviet shots already echoed on the outskirts of Berlin. The Reich, which promised to last 1,000 years, collapsed 11 days after Canaris's death. When Allied troops liberated Flossenburg, they found his last writings hidden under the cell floor, and on one of those pages, a single line summed up the tragedy of his life, and perhaps of the entire war. Truth does not need to win. It just needs to survive long enough to be remembered. The silence after the war was not that of peace, it was that of astonishment. As Allied troops sifted through the Reich's wreckage, what they found were not just ruins and ashes, but files, mountains of papers, reports, memoranda, and diaries that together formed the mental portrait of a regime that had destroyed itself with its own illusions. Among these documents, a set of tattered folders caught the attention of British investigators. Abwehr, Strategic Reports, 1942 to 1944. Inside them were Wilhelm Canaris's forgotten warnings, cold reports, charts, meticulous notes, and amid it all, a name that repeated with almost prophetic insistence: Willow Run. Allied analysts were stunned. The precision of Canaris's projections bordered on the impossible. He had predicted, with minimal margin of error, the exponential growth of American production, the saturation of the Luftwaffe, and even the approximate date when Germany would lose air supremacy. These calculations are more accurate than our own intelligence reports, a British colonel commented while examining the documents. But the discovery came with a bitter feeling. The truth was there, detailed, unquestionable, and had been deliberately ignored by those who needed it most. Canaris's report, shelved as alarmist, was now one of the most symbolic proofs of the German defeat. It was not the lack of information that destroyed the Reich, but the refusal to believe it. Soon after, the Allies found another treasure, more intimate and devastating. In the ruins of Flossenburg, an American soldier collected a small bundle of yellowed papers, hidden under a cell floor. They were Canaris's diaries, written in fragments with graphite and narrow margins. They revealed a man torn between duty and conscience. In them, he recorded not just facts, but reflections on the nature of truth and obedience. He wrote, "Fanaticism is the refuge of the weak, and loyalty without reason is the most dangerous form of treason." Those phrases, decades later, would be quoted in universities, books, and documentaries as a rare glimmer of lucidity in the Nazi darkness. The war had turned Canaris into what he most feared being, a man right in the wrong time. In the following years, Canaris's name began to resurface, slowly, almost shamefully. For many, he remained an officer of the regime, a man who served the machine that destroyed Europe. For others, he was a tragic figure, a modern Cassandra who predicted disaster and was punished for telling the truth. In 1949, during denazification trials, former Abwehr officers testified in his favor. Some reported how he had sabotaged SS operations. Others confirmed he used his own espionage network to save lives. It was the beginning of a quiet rehabilitation.
History began to see what the politics of the time could not admit. Canaris was not the Reich's spy. He was the spy who tried to stop the Reich. In the 1950s, his predictions about Willow Run were published in American historical reports. War economy experts called his study one of the most impressive strategic analyses of the 20th century. And over time, Canaris's figure occupied a curious place in German memory, a flagless patriot, an officer who believed more in reason than ideology, a man who understood defeat before everyone else. Today his name is remembered not among conquerors, but among the foreseers, those who saw the future clearly and were destroyed for it. And his diaries, kept in the German Federal Archives, remain an eternal warning. Nations do not die when they lose wars, but when they stop listening to those who think. The truth the regime tried to bury with him survived. And ironically, it was Canaris who had the last word, because his prediction of the Reich's end not only came true, but became one of the most precise moral autopsies of modern history. He died as a traitor, but history resurrected him as what Hitler feared most, a man who won through reason. Willow Run was not just a factory, it was the turning point in human history, the moment when war ceased to be decided by generals and began to be won by engineers and workers. When Henry Ford and Albert Kahn imagined an assembly line capable of manufacturing B-24 Liberator bombers as if they were cars, they were not just creating an industrial feat, they were redefining the very nature of war. And it was there, in that gigantic Michigan building, that the 20th century discovered the true meaning of the word power. In 1944, the factory produced a complete bomber every 63 minutes. Meanwhile, Germany took weeks to assemble a single plane. Willow Run turned time into a weapon. And in war, time is worth more than any technology. The assembly lines ran without pause, 24 hours a day, powered by hundreds of thousands of human hands. Women, blacks, immigrants, young and old, all were part of a system that seemed like a steel orchestra conducted by stopwatches. The roar of presses and the snap of rivets were the music of the future. And that future, as Canaris had predicted with exactness, no longer belonged to Germany. Willow Run's impact went beyond World War II. It gave birth to what President Roosevelt would call the arsenal of democracy, the idea that a nation's industrial strength is as decisive as its armies. From that plant came not just planes, but the philosophy that would shape the entire post-war era: mass production, standardization, speed. Willow Run was the cradle of the mentality that later fueled the Cold War, the space race, and modern capitalism itself. It was the victory of organization over ideology, system over myth. While the Reich believed in destiny, the United States believed in schedules. And schedules, unlike myths, work. But there is a profound irony in all this. The same model of efficiency that defeated totalitarianism would eventually become an impersonal and dehumanized power. Willow Run was not just the triumph of industrial freedom, it was also the birth of the age of machines,
where the individual becomes just another cog. What began as the symbol of democratic victory evolved into the paradigm of global corporations and economic Cold Wars. Canaris, if he had lived to see it, might have understood. The factory he feared as an instrument of German destruction was at the same time the beginning of a new form of mechanical slavery. Modern man had won the war, but surrendered part of his soul to the rhythm of the assembly lines. Today, Willow Run's ruins still exist. The sound of machines has been replaced by the empty echo of historical tours and Michigan winds. But its legacy continues to pulse. The same logic that produced bombers in series now produces chips, satellites, and autonomous weapons. The assembly line has become digital, and the whole world has turned into Willow Run. Industry defeated ideology, but the question Canaris left hanging still echoes. What if one day the machine stops serving man and man begins to serve it? Willow Run was the epitaph of the old war and the prelude to the new. The factory that symbolized the end of the Reich inaugurated the era in which efficiency replaced courage and production replaced heroism. And at the center of that transformation, between Berlin's shadows and Michigan's steel, Canaris's prophecy remains. Empires do not fall for lack of soldiers, but when the numbers stop lying and no one wants to hear them anymore. The end of the Reich was just the beginning of something greater. When the ashes settled over Europe, the world realized that modern war was not fought by armies, but by systems. Wilhelm Canaris, the man who predicted collapse in spreadsheets and numbers, had seen the future more clearly than any general. His mistake was believing that reason could save a nation intoxicated by myth. Willow Run continued to exist, not as a factory, but as a metaphor. It symbolizes the point where human intellect defeated ignorance, but also the moment when humanity surrendered its soul to efficiency. The world learned from the Reich's defeat, but perhaps forgot the deeper lesson. Truth does not destroy. What destroys is ignoring it. Today, every technological advance, every automated system, every blind decision made in the name of progress echoes Canaris's warning. History does not repeat, it warns. And, as he wrote before dying, Germany lost by denying reality. And every time the world does the same, the Reich is reborn, not in arms, but in ideas.